The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the suffocating weight of a death sentence. Lorenzo Volkov sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silhouette framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 64th floor penthouse. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The man trembling at the other end of the table, a disgraced associate named Miller, was already sweating through his silk suit. "I don't like repetitive mistakes, Miller," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, melodic growl. He toyed with a heavy gold lighter, the metallic click-clack echoing like a ticking clock. "They suggest a lack of respect. Or worse, a lack of intelligence." "Please, Mr. Volkov," Miller stammered, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "The shipment was seized by the feds. I had no choice." Lorenzo signaled to his lead enforcer, Victor, who stood like a stone statue by the door. The message was clear. The conversation was over, and Miller wouldn't be leaving the building through the lobby. But before Victor could move, a strange sound broke the deadly silence. It wasn't the sound of a gun being cocked or a man begging for mercy. It was a soft, wet thump-thump-thump against the plush Italian carpet. Then a high-pitched, bubbly giggle echoed through the room. Lorenzo froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his glass, stopped mid-air. From beneath the heavy velvet curtains near the side entrance, a small blonde head popped out. A toddler, no more than 2 years old, crawled into the center of the room with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He was wearing a slightly stained onesie and clutching a plastic dinosaur. He was followed closely by a second child, a girl with the exact same silver-gray eyes, who was dragging a silk pillow behind her like a captured prize. The room went bone dry. The most dangerous men in the city stared in stunned silence as the two toddlers navigated the kill zone of the boardroom. The boy reached Lorenzo's chair first. Without a hint of fear, he grabbed the hem of Lorenzo's trousers to pull himself up. He looked up at the Mafia boss, let out a toothy grin, and began to gnaw enthusiastically on the toe of Lorenzo's handcrafted leather shoe. "Leo, Mia, no!" A frantic, muffled cry came from the doorway. Elena stood there, her face white as a sheet, her maid's uniform wrinkled and dusted with flour. Her heart was hammering so hard against her ribs, she thought it might shatter them. She had only turned her back for a second to grab their milk bottles, and they had slipped through the service door. She looked from her children to the terrifying man at the head of the table. She knew the rules. No one entered this room. To witness a meeting was a liability. To interrupt one was a death wish. Lorenzo didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at Victor. His gaze was locked on the small boy currently drooling on his shoe. His eyes, usually as cold as a Siberian winter, flickered with a sudden, violent recognition. He looked at the shape of the boy's jaw, the specific arch of the girl's brow, and then finally, his piercing stare snapped up to Elena. The silence lasted a lifetime. Miller, seeing a momentary distraction, tried to bolt for the door, but Victor shoved him back into his seat without even looking away from the children. Lorenzo slowly pushed his chair back. The screech of the wood against the floor made Elena flinch, expecting the worst. He knelt down, a man who knelt for no one, and placed a large, scarred hand on the boy's small shoulder. Surprisingly, a smile broke across his face, wide and genuine, as he reached out toward the laughing infants. "Elena?" Lorenzo said. His voice was different now. It wasn't the cold growl of a killer. It was the possessive purr of a predator who had just found something he didn't know he'd lost. "I believe we need to discuss your resignation, because you aren't leaving this house again." The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a finality that made Elena's knees buckle. Inside the office, the air was static with a new kind of electricity. Lorenzo remained on the floor, his vibrant yellow suit jacket bunching at his shoulders as he stayed eye-level with the twins. Leo was patting Lorenzo's tattooed neck with a sticky hand, while Mia had abandoned her silk pillow to investigate the shiny gold buttons on his cuff. Lorenzo didn't look like a monster in this light. He looked like a man seeing his own ghost. He reached out, his large thumb gently brushing over Mia's cheek, tracing the exact line of a jawbone that was a miniature replica of his own. The coldness that usually defined him had been replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused intensity. "Victor," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Get Miller out of here. Clear the floor. I want no one in this wing. Now." The enforcer moved with silent efficiency, dragging the terrified associate out of the room. The click of the lock turning felt like a bolt sliding into place on Elena's own coffin. She stood frozen by the door, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron until her knuckles turned white. "Come here, Elena," Lorenzo commanded. He didn't look up. He was busy caught in a staring match with Leo, who was babbling a string of nonsense that Lorenzo seemed to be studying as if it were a high-level code. Elena took a shaky step forward, then another, until she was standing just a few feet away from the man she had spent 3 years hiding from. I'm so sorry, Mr. Volkov. They escaped the nursery. It won't happen again. I'll take them and leave." "Leave?" Lorenzo finally looked up. The silver gray of his eyes was a perfect match for the children's, but his were filled with a turbulent storm of anger and wonder. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, towering over her. "You think you're taking them anywhere?" He stepped into her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and something metallic, swirled around her. He reached out, not for her, but to block her path, his arm leaning against the wall behind her, cornering her. "I spent months looking for you after that night," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "I thought you were just a girl who got scared. A temporary distraction who took a payoff and vanished. I didn't realize you stole something from me." "I didn't steal anything," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "I protected them. I knew what your life was. I didn't want them near the blood, the guns, the Millers of the world." Lorenzo's eyes darkened. He looked back at the twins, who were now sitting on the rug playing with his gold lighter, a deadly toy he had forgotten to move. He didn't snatch it away. He simply watched them with a hungry, possessive look. "You hid my heirs in a maid's quarters," he said, the realization sounding like a sin to him. "You let my children eat crumbs while I sat at a table of gold. Look at them, Elena. Look at their eyes." He grabbed her chin, forced her to look at the babies, and then back at him. The resemblance was undeniable. It was a brand. "They are Volkov's," he declared, his voice vibrating with a dark triumph. "And you are the woman who kept them from me. I should be furious. Yeah, I should cast you out and keep them." Elena's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. "Please, Lorenzo, don't take them." A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips as he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm not going to take them, Elena, but you're never leaving this estate again. From this moment on, you aren't the maid. You're mine. And I'm going to make sure you never forget who these children belong to." The transition happened with a speed that left Elena breathless. Within an hour, her meager belongings from the cramped staff quarters, a few worn books, the twins' favorite stuffed rabbits, and her modest clothes, had been moved by silent, stone-faced men into the sprawling master wing of the penthouse. The air here was different. It was filtered, cool, and carried the heavy scent of expensive leather and polished marble. Lorenzo watched from the doorway as a team of assistants brought in brand-new, white-lacquered cribs and piles of high-end toys that still had the tags on them. He hadn't left their side since the boardroom. It was as if he were afraid that if he looked away, the vision of his children would vanish like smoke. "This is too much, Lorenzo," Elena whispered, standing in the center of a bedroom larger than her entire childhood home. The walls were a soft cream, and the floor was covered in a rug so thick the twins were having trouble crawling across it without toppling over. "They don't need all of this. They just need to be safe." "They are safe," Lorenzo replied, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. He stepped into the room, his yellow suit jacket now discarded. His white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the intricate black ink crawling up his forearms. This floor is a fortress. There are guards at every elevator and cameras in every hall. No one gets in without my thumbprint. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. And how do we get out? Lorenzo turned to her, his expression unreadable. He walked toward her until he was close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that were currently tracking every movement of the twins. You don't. Not anymore. The world outside is full of people who would use these children to get to me. I won't give them that chance. You're making us prisoners, she realized, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. I'm making you protected, he countered. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he pulled it back, as if remembering they weren't on those terms. Yet. You spent 3 years living in the shadows, Elena, cleaning floors and hiding in corners. That life is over. You will have everything you want, but you will stay where I can see you. Mia let out a happy squeal, having discovered a motorized toy car that zoomed across the floor at a touch. Lorenzo's gaze softened for a fleeting second as he watched his daughter, but when he looked back at Elena, the iron was back in his stare. There will be a tutor for them, a private chef, and whatever staff you require, he continued, his tone clinical. But the service entrance is off-limits to you. Your old keycard has been deactivated. From now on, you are the lady of this house, not the help. Elena looked at the massive glass windows. In below them, the city lights flickered like a million distant stars. It was beautiful, but from this height, it looked like a map of a world she no longer belonged to. She was trapped in the clouds with a man who had the power of a king and the soul of a wolf. What if I say no? She asked, her voice small. Lorenzo stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her temple in a gesture that was half caress and half threat. You already said no for 3 years, Elena. You used up all your no's. From now on, the answer is always yes. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at Leo, who was currently trying to climb onto one of the new cribs. Get settled. We eat dinner at 8. I expect you and my children to be there. The heavy door clicked shut, and the sound of the electronic lock engaging felt like the final bars of a cage sliding into place. It was a gilded cage, filled with silk and gold, but a cage, nonetheless. Elena sank onto the edge of the massive bed, watching her twins play, wondering if she had saved them or led them into the heart of the storm. The silence of the penthouse at night was far heavier than the noise of the day. As Elena tucked the twins into their new plush cribs, the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows pulled her back to a night she had tried to bury under layers of floor wax and laundry detergent. It was 3 years ago, but the memory was as vivid as a fresh bruise. She hadn't been a maid then. She had been a temporary waitress at a high-stakes charity gala, a girl working 3 jobs to keep her head above water. Lorenzo Volkov had been the most magnetic thing in the room, a dark sun that everyone else orbited. He had spent the evening surrounded by politicians and beautiful women, yet his gaze had kept snagging on her as she moved through the crowd with her tray of champagne. The chemistry hadn't been a slow burn, it was an explosion. When they finally spoke in the shadows of the balcony, his voice hadn't been cold. It had been filled with a raw, dangerous heat that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. One night, he had promised. One night where the world didn't exist, they had ended up in his private suite, a place of silk sheets and the same sandalwood scent that now filled this penthouse. In his arms, he hadn't been the ice boss. He had been a man who touched her as if she were made of glass, each whispering promises of a life she couldn't imagine. For a few hours, she allowed herself to believe that a girl like her could be loved by a man like him. But the morning had brought a brutal reality. She had woken up early, intended to slip away before the sun rose. But as she looked for her shoes, She had overheard a conversation through the cracked door of his study. Lorenzo was on the phone, his voice stripped of the warmth from the night before. He was giving an order, cold, calculated, and blood-chilling, for the removal of a rival's family. He spoke of life and death as if he were discussing the weather. In that moment, the scales fell from her eyes. She saw the man behind the mask. He wasn't just a powerful businessman, he was a predator, whose world was built on a foundation of violence. She looked at the expensive watch he had left on the nightstand and realized that being with him wouldn't be a fairy tale. It would be an invitation to a life where she and any future she held would be collateral damage in his wars. Panic had set in. She didn't just leave, she ran. She changed her phone number, moved to a different district, and took the lowliest job possible, a maid in his own organization, reasoning that the last place a king looks for a runaway is among those cleaning his floors. She thought she could hide in the periphery, a ghost in a uniform. Then came the morning sickness. Then came the realization that she was carrying two pieces of a man she was terrified to love. Elena looked at the twins now, their small chests rising and falling in perfect unison. She had fled to save their souls from the darkness of the Volkov name. She had wanted them to grow up where the only orders they heard were to finish their vegetables, not to end lives. The door to the nursery creaked open. Lorenzo stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light. He didn't enter, but his presence filled the room, shattering her reverie. "You're thinking about that night," he said, his voice a low vibration in the dark. "I'm thinking about why I left," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Leo's sleeping face. "You left because you were a coward." Lorenzo stepped into the room, the moonlight catching the hard line of his jaw. "But you won't get the chance to be one again. I've spent 3 years without my family. I don't intend to spend another minute." The morning brought a sterile, white-coated intrusion into the gilded sanctuary of the penthouse. Lorenzo didn't trust the word of a maid, even one he had shared a bed with, and he certainly didn't trust his own eyes when it came to the succession of the Volkov Empire. He had summoned his private physician, a man sworn to more secrecy than a priest, to take the samples. Elena watched with a lump in her throat as the doctor gently swabbed the inside of Leo and Mia's mouths. The twins treated it like a game, giggling and reaching for the doctor's stethoscope, blissfully unaware that their very identities were being decoded into data points. Lorenzo stood by the window, his back to the room, his posture as rigid as a soldier's. He didn't speak until the doctor had packed his kit and disappeared through the heavy doors. 6 hours, Lorenzo said, finally turning around. "The lab is already running the sequence. By noon, the world changes." The wait was a slow torture. While the machines whirred in a lab across town, Lorenzo's inner circle began to gather in the downstairs drawing room. Elena could hear the low rumble of voices, the lieutenants, the lawyers, and the family elders who held the traditions of the syndicate close to their chests. When the call finally came, Lorenzo didn't take it in private. He put it on speakerphone in front of his counsel. "The match is 99.9%, Mr. Volkov." The doctor's voice crackled through the room. "They are yours." The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke. Elena stood at the top of the grand staircase, clutching the banister, looking down at the circle of men who governed the city's underworld. Maid's bastards?" The voice belonged to Silas, an older man with silver hair and a scar that ran through his eyebrow. He was one of the few who dared to speak plainly to Lorenzo. "You expect us to bow to children born of a runaway servant? This isn't just a scandal, Lorenzo. It's a weakness. The other families will see this as an opening." Lorenzo didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He walked slowly toward Silas, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "They aren't bastards, Silas. They are Volkovs. And as for the mother..." He looked up, his silver eyes finding Elena at the top of the stairs. The men followed his gaze, their eyes scanning her like she was a bug under a microscope. She felt small, exposed, and utterly terrified. She was still wearing her simple dress, in a stark contrast to the opulence of the room. "She is the mother of my heirs," Lorenzo continued, his voice echoing with a dark, undisputed authority. "Anyone who treats her as anything less than the queen of this house will answer to me, directly." "The succession is clear," another associate muttered, though he looked at his shoes rather than at Lorenzo. "If they are blood, they are the future." "Exactly," Lorenzo said. He turned back to his men, his face a mask of iron. "The news stays within these walls for now. If a single word of their existence reaches the streets before I am ready to announce it, I will find the leak, and I will cauterize it. Am I understood?" A chorus of, "Yes, boss," rippled through the room, but the air remained thick with resentment. Elena saw the way Silas looked at her. Not with respect, but with the calculating gaze of a man looking for a soft spot in an armor. Lorenzo climbed the stairs toward her, ignoring his counsel as if they were nothing more than furniture. He stopped on the step just below her, bringing them eye to eye. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was possessive, a public claim that left no room for doubt. "It's official now, Elena," he whispered so only she could hear. "You gave me the world, even if you tried to hide it. Now you'll have to watch me burn anyone who tries to take it back." The heavy, oppressive tension of the boardroom felt miles away as evening settled over the penthouse. Elena stood in the doorway of the nursery, her breath catching in her throat at a sight she never thought possible. Lorenzo, the man who decided the fate of empires with a flick of his wrist, was down on his hands and knees on the thick plush carpet. He had discarded his dress shirt, wearing only a black undershirt that stretched across his broad shoulders, revealing the full extent of the tattoos that mapped out his violent history. But his hands, which Elena knew could be lethal, were currently occupied with a wooden shape sorter. Leo was sitting directly in front of him, chewing on a blue plastic triangle and staring at Lorenzo with wide, expectant eyes. Mia was perched behind the Mafia boss, trying to use his sturdy back as a ladder to reach a floating balloon tied to a nearby chair. "No, Leo, the square doesn't go in the round hole," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a low, patient hum she had never heard before. He gently took the toddler's hand and guided the block toward the correct slot. When it clicked into place, Leo let out a shriek of delight and clapped his hands against Lorenzo's chest. A small, genuine chuckle escaped Lorenzo's lips, a sound so foreign to the sterile luxury of the penthouse that it made Elena's heart ache. He reached back without looking and caught Mia just as she began to slide, tucking her safely under his arm like a football while she giggled uncontrollably. "You're surprisingly good at that," Elena whispered, finally stepping into the room. Lorenzo's head snapped up, the habitual mask of the cold leader flickering back for a split second before it softened again at the sight of her. He didn't get up. He remained on the floor, surrounded by the chaos of childhood. "I have a lot of lost time to make up for," he said, his gaze returning to Mia, who was now tugging on his silver chain. "I spent my life building a kingdom I thought would end with me. I never realized I was building it for them." Elena sat on the edge of a nearby armchair, watching the way he interacted with the children. There was no hesitation in his movements, no awkwardness. It was as if a dormant instinct had been triggered the moment the paternity results were finalized. He wasn't just claiming them as heirs, he was learning them as people. "They like you," she observed softly. "They're usually shy around strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Lorenzo replied, his voice firm but not harsh. "I'm their blood. They know it, even if they don't have the words for it yet." He picked up a picture book from the floor, one about a lonely lion, and opened it. To Elena's utter shock, the man who commanded an army of killers began to read aloud, pointing at the illustrations with a scarred finger. As he read, the twins settled. Leo leaned his head against Lorenzo's knee, and Mia curled into the crook of his elbow. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that for a moment Elena could almost forget the guards at the door and the disappeared associates. But then Lorenzo looked at her over the top of the book, and the predatory heat in his eyes reminded her exactly who he was. This wasn't just a father bonding with his children. This was a man securing his most precious assets. "They deserve the world, Elena," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive register. "And I'm going to make sure the world is too afraid to ever touch them. That includes you. You did well keeping them alive, but from now on, I'm the one who keeps them safe." He turned back to the book, but the peace of the moment had shifted. Elena realized that while Lorenzo might have a heart for his children, his mercy for her was still a debt she hadn't yet paid. The transformation was as cold and efficient as a business merger. Instead of the flour-dusted maid's uniform she had worn for years, Elena found herself draped in silk the color of a midnight bruise. The dress was a masterpiece of restraint and power, hugging every curve she had spent 3 years trying to hide. As the stylist fastened a diamond choker around her neck, Elena felt less like a guest and more like a high-stakes prisoner being prepared for display. "You look like a queen, Elena," Lorenzo said, appearing in the doorway of the dressing room. He was a vision of lethal elegance in a charcoal suit, his silver-gray eyes scanning her with a hunger that made her skin prickle. "It's time the city sees what I've been hiding." "They aren't ready for this, Lorenzo," Elena pleaded, her voice trembling as she looked at her reflection. "They're just babies. If you announce them to the world, you put a target on their backs that will never go away." Lorenzo walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the marble. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm and unyielding. "The target is already there, Elena. The moment they were born with my blood, their lives became a battlefield. Tonight, I'm simply telling the world who owns the field." The gala was held in a ballroom that felt more like a cathedral of excess. Gold leaf trimmed the pillars, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. As they entered, the roar of conversation died down into a jagged, expectant silence. Every eye in the room, rival bosses, corrupt politicians, and socialites, turned toward the man who held the city in his grip and the woman on his arm. Elena's heart thundered against her ribs. She felt like an imposter, a common girl playing a deadly game. But Lorenzo didn't falter. He led her to the center of the raised dais, his hand never leaving the small of her back. It wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a mark of ownership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lorenzo's voice rang out, carrying the effortless authority that defined him. "There has been much speculation about the future of the Volkov line. Tonight, I put those rumors to rest." He signaled to the side entrance. Victor appeared, carrying Leo and Mia. The twins were dressed in miniature versions of formal wear, Mia looking confused, but remarkably calm under the bright chandeliers. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. In the underworld, heirs were everything, and twins were a sign of double strength, or double vulnerability. "These are my children," Lorenzo declared, his gaze sweeping across the room like a threat. "And this is Elena. She is the mother of my heirs, and she carries my protection. To touch them is to invite my wrath. To disrespect her is to challenge me directly." The announcement was a declaration of war disguised as a debut. Elena looked out at the sea of faces and saw the mask of polite society slipping. She saw Silas in the corner, his expression unreadable, and she saw the predatory glints in the eyes of Lorenzo's rivals. They weren't looking at the twins with joy. They were measuring the weight of the crown Lorenzo had just placed on their small heads. As the music resumed, Lorenzo leaned down, his lips brushing Elena's ear. "Smile, Elena. The world is watching." "They hate us," she whispered, her eyes fixed on her children, who were being whisked back to the safety of the penthouse by a team of guards. "Let them hate," Lorenzo replied, his hand tightening on her waist as he pulled her into a dance. "As long as they fear us, we win. You aren't a maid anymore, Elena. You're the woman who gave the lion his pride. and I'm never letting you go back to the shadows." The dance felt like a funeral march for her old life. She was no longer invisible. She was the most famous woman in the city, and the cage had just become a palace that the whole world was trying to break into. The aftermath of the gala felt like the calm before a storm that had already been promised. While the city gossiped about the Maid Queen and the Volkov heirs, the air inside the penthouse grew heavy with a new kind of silence. Elena spent her hours in the nursery, watching the shadows stretch across the floor, unable to shake the feeling that by stepping into the light, they had invited the dark to follow. In a dimly lit corner of a club across town, Silas sat with his silver hair gleaming under neon lights. He had served the Volkov family for decades, but he was a man of the old guard. To him, Lorenzo's sudden softness for a servant and her children wasn't a beautiful story. It was a structural weakness in the empire he had helped build. He swirled a glass of amber liquid, his eyes fixed on a man sitting across from him, Mikhail, one the head of a rival syndicate that had been looking for a crack in the Volkov armor for years. "He's distracted, Mikhail," Silas said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the thumping bass of the music. "He spends his mornings on a rug playing with blocks instead of overseeing the docks. He's vulnerable." Mikhail leaned forward, a hungry smile playing on his lips. "The penthouse is a fortress, Silas. Even with your help, getting inside is a suicide mission." "You don't need to get inside the penthouse," Silas replied, sliding a small encrypted drive across the table. "You just need to know the route. In 2 days, Lorenzo is moving them to the summer estate for security. He thinks the mountain air will be better for them. The motorcade will be smaller, more discreet. He's trying to hide them in plain sight." The drive contained the GPS coordinates, the timing of the shift change, and the specific armored car that would carry the twins. It was the ultimate betrayal, a map to the heart of the Volkov family. Silas told himself he was doing it for the good of the organization, to purge the weakness, but the glint of greed in his eyes suggested he was simply choosing a new king. Back at the penthouse, Elena was packing a small bag for the move. She felt a hand on her shoulder and jumped, turning to find Lorenzo standing behind her. He looked tired, the strain of maintaining a double life carving deeper lines into his face. "You're nervous," he noted, his voice softer than usual. "I don't like moving them, Lorenzo," she admitted, clutching a pair of tiny socks. "Here, we are safe. Out there, on the road." Gee, we're exposed. Lorenzo took the socks from her hands and set them down. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into the solid strength of his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart that everyone else feared. "I have my best men on this, Elena. Victor will be leading the escort. Nothing will happen to them, I promise you." He meant it, but Lorenzo Volkov, for all his power, didn't know that the rot had already started from within. He didn't know that the very men who had bowed to him at the gala were already dividing up his territory. As the sun began to rise on the day of the move, a series of burner phones across the city buzzed with a single message: "The targets are moving. Intercept at the pass." In the secret Elena had kept for 3 years to protect her children had been turned into a weapon, and the fuse was already lit. The transition to the summer estate was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of tall pines and mountain air where the twins could run on grass instead of marble. But the peace lasted only until the second night. The mountain silence was shattered not by a storm, but by the synchronized thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire taking out the perimeter guards. Elena was in the nursery, humming a low lullaby to Leo, when the first explosion rocked the house. The windows didn't shatter. They were reinforced, but the entire floor shuddered. The power cut out instantly, plunging the room into a terrifying, velvety blackness. Below them, the muffled sounds of shouting and heavy boots on the stairs signaled that the impenetrable fortress had been breached. "Mia! Leo!" Elena lunged for the cribs in the dark, her hands shaking so violently she could barely find the latches. She scooped both children up, one in each arm, their small bodies warm and trembling as they began to cry. The door burst open. Elena scrambled back into the corner, ready to scream, but the silhouette in the doorway was familiar. It was Lorenzo, but not the man who had played with blocks on the carpet. He was covered in soot, a jagged cut bleeding freely down his forehead, and he held a heavy rifle as if it were an extension of his own arm. "They're inside," Lorenzo rasped, his eyes scanning the room like a cornered wolf's. He reached into the waistband of his trousers and pulled out a sleek, black handgun. He didn't hand it to her. He shoved it into her hand, forcing her fingers around the grip. "Victor is dead. Silas betrayed us. I have to hold the hallway. If anyone besides me comes through that door, Elena, you don't hesitate. You aim for the chest and you pull." "Lorenzo, I can't." "You have to." He grabbed her face, his bloody thumb smearing her cheek. "You aren't a maid anymore. You are a mother protecting her blood. Do it for them." He disappeared back into the smoky corridor, the roar of his rifle immediately drowning out the twins' sobs. Elena was alone in the dark. She slumped against the wall, the heavy weight of the metal in her hand feeling like a curse. Every instinct told her to hide, to shrink into the shadows as she had for 3 years, but then she felt Mia's small hand clutching the fabric of her shirt. The sound of footsteps approached, heavy, hurried, and accompanied by the metallic clatter of gear. It wasn't Lorenzo's steady stride. The door handle turned. A flash grenade rolled into the room, blooming in a blinding white light that seared Elena's retinas. Through the spots in her vision, she saw a man in a tactical mask step through the frame, his weapon raised toward the cribs. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The fear that had paralyzed Elena for years vanished, replaced by a cold, white-hot vacuum of rage. She didn't think about the law or the blood. She thought about the 3 years she had spent scrubbing floors just to buy these children milk. She thought about the eyes that matched the man fighting in the hall. Elena raised the gun. Her arms didn't shake. She squeezed the trigger just as the intruder turned his barrel toward her. The recoil jolted her shoulder, the sound deafening in the small room. The man crumpled, his weapon clattering to the floor as he slumped against the doorframe. She didn't stop. She stood over her children, the gun leveled at the doorway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When a second shadow appeared, she almost fired again, but a voice stopped her. "It's me! It's me!" Lorenzo stumbled in, his shirt shredded, looking at the fallen assassin and then at Elena. His eyes widened in a mix of horror and profound, dark pride. He saw the way she stood, legs braced, eyes fierce, protecting their legacy with the same ruthlessness he used to rule the city. The siege wasn't over, but as Lorenzo stepped over the body to shield her and the twins with his own frame, Elena knew the invisible girl was gone forever. She had tasted the blood of the world she tried to escape, and she realized that to keep her children, she couldn't just hide from the monsters. She had to become the one they feared most. The smoke from the mountain air finally cleared, leaving behind a silence that was no longer threatening, but final. The summer estate had been purged. Lorenzo's men had spent the night scouring the woods, ensuring that every trace of Silas's betrayal and Mikhail's ambition was buried deep beneath the pines. The threat wasn't just gone. It had been erased with a clinical, terrifying efficiency that only a man like Lorenzo Volkov could command. Elena sat on the stone terrace, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the sun begin to peek over the jagged mountain peaks. Beside her, in a reinforced double stroller, Leo and Mia were fast asleep, exhausted by the night's chaos, but blissfully unaware of how close the world had come to ending for them. Elena looked at her hands, the same hands that had once scrubbed floors and changed diapers, and now, for the first time, knew the weight of a trigger. The glass door behind her slid open. Lorenzo stepped out, his movements stiff from the bandages wrapped tightly around his ribs. He had shed the suit and the tactical gear, wearing only a simple black sweater. He looked less like a boss and more like a man who had stared into the abyss and realized he didn't want to fall in alone. He didn't stand over her this time. He didn't loom or use his height to intimidate. Instead, he pulled a chair up beside her and sat down, his gaze fixed on the sleeping twins. "It's over," he said, his voice gravelly and quiet. "Silas is being dealt with. Mikhail's organization is in shambles. There is no one left who knows about them who isn't loyal to me by blood or by fear." "Is that how it's always going to be?" Elena asked, not looking away from the horizon. "A life of waiting for the next betrayal? A life where I have to teach my children how to fire a weapon before they can ride a bike?" Lorenzo was silent for a long time. The old Lorenzo would have told her that was the price of power. He would have told her she had no choice but to stay and accept his protection. But the man who had watched her stand her ground in the nursery was different. "I spent my whole life building walls to keep people out," Lorenzo said, reaching out to gently touch the stroller. "I thought that was how you survived. But last night I realized that walls don't matter if there's no one inside worth protecting. You aren't just the mother of my heirs, Elena. You're the only person who has ever looked at me and seen the man, not the crown." He turned his head to look at her, and for the first time, the silver in his eyes wasn't cold. It was vulnerable. "I told you once that you were mine," he continued, his voice steady but soft. "I told you that you weren't leaving. I was wrong to say it like that. I was a predator claiming a prize. But I don't want a prisoner, Elena. I want a partner. Someone who can hold the line when I can't." He reached out his hand, palm up, resting it on the table between them. It was an invitation, not a command. "I'm asking you to stay. Not because the doors are locked, and not because I'm the father of your children. Stay because you want to build a new order with me, one where we don't just survive the darkness, but we rule it together. For them. And for us." Elena looked at his hand, then at the twins, and finally into the eyes of the man who had changed the trajectory of her life twice. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a new, flickering sense of belonging. She realized she didn't want to run anymore. She didn't want to be the invisible maid hiding in the corners. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. "I'm not going back to the shadows, Lorenzo," she said, her voice echoing the strength she had found in the dark. "But if I stay, we do this as equals. No more secrets. No more gilded cages." Lorenzo squeezed her hand, a small, triumphant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "As equals," he agreed. The sun broke fully over the mountains, bathing the estate in a bright golden light. The old world was gone, and in its place, a new family had been forged in fire. The maid was gone, the boss had softened, and the twins were finally home.